This is the entire story of Snow White, told gently, slowly, and just for you. Before we begin, take a deep breath and tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Maybe your room is quiet, the lights are low, and your pillow is waiting. Wherever you are, you're safe now. This isn't a bedtime story rushed or skipped. It's the full journey, from the first snowfall to the final dream. So close your eyes when you're ready. Let go of the day, and fall asleep to a tale as old as time. It was the kind of winter morning that makes the world feel hushed. Soft snowflakes floated from a sky the color of pearl, dancing quietly down through the chilly air. Every rooftop was blanketed in white. Every tree branch wore a coat of frost. The palace sat still against the mountains, its tall towers cloaked in mist, its windows glowing dimly with golden firelight from within. Inside, all was quiet, except for the gentle crackling of a fire and the occasional echo of footsteps down stone halls. But in one high chamber, at a window framed by velvet curtains and rimmed in cold breath, sat a queen. She wore robes of deep red trimmed in silver fur, but her hands, pale and delicate, were bare as she worked. Before her was an embroidery frame, and on it stretched fine black velvet. She stitched patiently, carefully, her needle glinting in the morning light. Outside the window, the snow kept falling. Each flake looked like a star. Each gust of wind whispered secrets only winter could tell. The queen paused, letting her needle rest in the fabric. Her fingers lingered over her work, but her eyes were far away. There was a stillness in her gaze, something gentle, but heavy with longing. Then, without warning, her needle pricked her finger. A tiny drop of blood bloomed on her skin like a red petal on fresh snow. She watched it fall onto the black velvet, red on black, framed by the white lace of her sleeves. And in that moment, the queen made a wish. "If only I had a child," she whispered softly to herself, her voice almost too quiet for the room to hear. A daughter, with skin as white as snow, lips as red as blood, and hair as black as the wood on this frame. Her breath fogged the window pane. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Inside, something changed, like the faintest shimmer in the air, the gentlest tug of fate. The queen returned to her sewing, but the wish stayed with her, as if the winter itself had heard her words and was holding them in its arms. Days passed, and weeks followed. The snow melted, and the earth yawned into spring. The trees grew soft green buds, and the air filled with birdsong and sunlight. And then it happened. The queen, who had so longed for a child, learned that she was with child at last. The entire kingdom rejoiced. Bells rang through the villages, and garlands were strung across every door. In the palace, laughter returned to the halls, and the queen's face glowed like moonlight over still water. Months passed slowly. She walked in the gardens now, her steps lighter, her gaze softer. She would pause to feel her belly beneath her gown, humming quiet songs to the child within. And then came the day the child was born. A soft winter had returned that morning, as if to greet her. Snow fell once again, gently, peacefully, like the world was holding its breath. The queen's wish had come true. The baby girl had skin as white as snow, lips like the color of rose petals, and hair black as the ebony wood that framed the queen's window. She was named Snow White, and for a while, the world was perfect. The queen held her daughter close, breathing in her warmth like a lullaby. She would sing to her beneath candlelight, rock her beside the fire, and whisper dreams into her tiny ears. Snow White was a quiet baby, always watching with wide eyes, and in those eyes the queen saw hope, hope that reached beyond seasons, beyond time. But not all stories begin without sorrow. For not long after Snow White's birth, the queen, gentle, graceful, and so full of love, grew ill. The palace darkened. Doctors came and went, ministers prayed, and nurses lit candles in every window. But the queen grew quieter, like a candle burning low in the wind. One evening, when the snow had returned once more to kiss the ground, the queen asked to see her child one last time. Snow White, wrapped in soft white blankets, was placed gently in her arms. The queen smiled. "Your name is written in winter," she said softly, touching the child's dark hair. "May you always find warmth in the cold and kindness in the mirror." Then, with a sigh as soft as snowfall, she closed her eyes. And the first chapter of Snow White's life began with both love and loss. The kingdom mourned. Black banners were draped over palace gates. Villagers lit lanterns and placed them on snowy hillsides. In the forest, even the wind blew slower, quieter. Snow White was still just a baby, too young to understand. But some say she did not cry that day. Instead, she simply looked up at the falling snow, blinking slowly, calmly, as if some part of her knew the story had only just begun. The morning after her birth, the castle felt like it was holding its breath. Snow lay gently across the rooftops. Candles flickered in every window. The air smelled of wood smoke, lavender, and something new, something gentle and alive. In the royal chambers, where velvet drapes softened the light and everything seemed to glow with a golden hush, the tiniest sound could be heard: a baby breathing. Snow White. She was swaddled in a blanket as white as the clouds outside, her face soft and pink with sleep. Her eyelashes, already long, rested against her pale cheeks, and her tiny hands peeked out, curling unconsciously like flower petals just beginning to open. The nurses who watched over her whispered softly to one another, unable to look away. "She's beautiful," one said, her voice barely more than a breath. "She looks like something from a story," said another. "She is a story," whispered the oldest among them, smiling down, "and the whole kingdom will know her name." The king, still weary with sorrow and love, stood silently by the window. He had lost his queen, but gained a daughter. His heart felt like it had been broken and mended in the same moment. He stepped forward and gently took the child into his arms. Snow White stirred, made a tiny sound like a bird dreaming, and fell back into her peaceful sleep. The king looked down at her and whispered, "You are the light she left behind." And with that, her name, Snow White, was spoken again, this time not as a wish, but as a promise. As the weeks passed, life in the castle began to return, not to what it had been, but to something new, quieter, softer. Every hallway, once filled with royal business and hurried steps, now slowed for the sound of a baby laughing. The maids hung sun-colored ribbons in the nursery. The guards brought carved wooden toys from the village. Even the castle cats, who once kept strictly to their window seats, now followed wherever Snow White was carried. There was something about her presence, something still and bright and watching. It wasn't just beauty, it was calm. By the time she could walk, Snow White had become the beating heart of the palace. She wore gowns of cotton and velvet, always simple, always warm. Her hair, black as night, curled softly at the edges, and her eyes sparkled like the river just before a snowfall. She had a way of tilting her head when she listened, as if she were hearing more than just your words. She would crouch beside the garden birds, hand outstretched, never startling them. She would pet the hounds and speak to them in whispers, and they would wag their tails and follow her in perfect silence. Even the old cook in the palace kitchen, who rarely smiled and always wore a dusting of flour, would hum when Snow White wandered in. The king, though still dressed in black, would often sit in the nursery, not to rule, not to command, but just to watch. She reminded him of the queen in the curve of her smile, but Snow White had something more, a softness that belonged only to her. He would read her stories at twilight, stories of brave girls, clever birds, hidden treasures, and kingdoms ruled by kindness instead of gold. And when she yawned, he would tuck her in beneath a quilt made of red and silver threads, kiss her forehead, and whisper, "Sleep well, my star." And she would. When Snow White turned 5, a portrait was commissioned. Not the stiff kind with crowns and cold eyes, but one painted in the garden, beside the ivy wall, where sun filtered through green leaves. She wore a dress the color of spring rain. A ribbon tied her hair back loosely. She was seated cross-legged on the grass, smiling, not at the painter, but at something behind him. Later, when people saw the painting, they all asked the same thing. What was she smiling at? No one ever knew, but those who looked long enough always felt lighter. As she grew, Snow White began asking questions. Why do flowers open after the snow melts? Do the clouds ever touch the tops of the mountains? What happens to wishes that don't come true? She didn't ask like a child expecting an answer. She asked like someone listening for one. She once followed a bee across the garden for nearly an hour, just to see where it disappeared. She knelt beside a turtle and watched it move so slowly, as if it were teaching her something. She never rushed. She was never loud. But wherever she went, the world seemed to follow. And yet, not all was still. Far across the kingdom, word of Snow White's beauty had begun to spread, first in whispers, then in songs. By the time she was 6, bards in the market sang of the girl with lips like roses and eyes like stormlight. Merchants spoke of a princess born of winter and sorrow who smiled like the morning sun. Even travelers from distant lands brought tales back of the child of snow who walked through meadows and left flowers blooming behind her. It was innocent praise, but praise can grow heavy. And in a tall tower deep inside the castle, behind doors of ironwood and drapes of black silk, someone was listening. The queen. Not the one who had made the wish by the window. She was gone, buried beneath marble and memory. No, this queen came after. She was tall and regal, with hair like polished obsidian and eyes as sharp as glass. Her gowns were always the deepest green or blackest velvet. Her perfume smelled faintly of crushed petals and something colder, like iron. To the people she was a mystery, beautiful but distant, kind but never warm. She rarely left her chambers except for court events. She rarely spoke unless spoken to, but she watched. She watched the kingdom. She watched the halls. And most of all, she watched the mirror. It was a tall mirror, its frame carved with thorns and vines, its surface perfectly smooth. No servant cleaned it. No one else was allowed near it. The queen would stand before it often, sometimes for hours. She would brush her hair, adjust her crown, stare into the glass, and whisper, "Tell me, mirror, who is the fairest of them all?" And for a long time, the mirror answered what she longed to hear. You are the fairest." And the queen would nod, satisfied, and return to her silent world. But time, like snow, is always falling, and children always grow. In the great halls of the castle, portraits lined the walls, paintings of kings and queens long past, their faces frozen in dignity. But one painting was missing. The queen who once sat by the window, who pricked her finger in the snow and wished for a daughter, had not been painted. By the time the artist was summoned, she had already faded like breath on glass. Instead, the castle hung silence in her place. For a long while the king ruled alone. He loved his daughter deeply, but the palace, grand and echoing, grew cold without a queen, and the kingdom, ever watchful, began to whisper, "A king without a queen," they said, "is a book missing its cover." So one winter, not long after Snow White's 5th birthday, the king married again. She came from a far-off land, her procession glittering with gold and green banners, silks that shimmered like moonlight, and jewels so bright they looked like stolen stars. The people gathered in the streets to see her arrival. Some cheered, some watched in silence, some whispered, "She is too beautiful to be real." And in many ways, they were right. The new queen had a kind of beauty that made you forget where you were, eyes like carved emeralds, skin without a single blemish, hair darker than raven's wings, cascading like silk down her back. She smiled often, but it was the kind of smile that made you wonder what she was thinking. It was graceful, elegant, and entirely unreadable. She spoke softly in court, her words chosen like the placing of pearls. She bowed to elders. She complimented the cooks. She even gifted Snow White a silver hair comb on her 6th birthday. And yet, the castle never warmed to her. Servants learned quickly to walk more quietly near her chambers. Guards avoided her gaze if they could help it. Even the animals, cats, birds, the hounds that once trailed Snow White, kept their distance. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was something colder, something that lived beneath the silence of her footsteps, something that flickered behind her eyes when she looked into her mirror. Yes, the mirror. It stood taller than any man, framed in twisted silver branches that wrapped around its sides like frozen ivy. It was not placed in a ballroom or a hallway, or even the queen's dressing room. It had its own chamber. Hidden behind 2 heavy oak doors, past velvet curtains and mosaics of gold tile, was a circular room with no windows, only the mirror. And she would visit it alone. Every morning, before the court rose and the bells chimed through the towers, the queen would enter the mirror room. She would stand barefoot on the cold tile floor. She would let the silence wrap around her like a second gown. And then she would speak. "Mirror, mirror on the wall." Her voice, never raised, never rushed, barely echoed. "Who is the fairest of them all?" And each time, the surface of the mirror would shimmer, not with reflection, but with something else, like moonlight in deep water. Then came the answer, not in sound, but in presence. The mirror would breathe the words into her mind. You are the fairest of them all." The queen would close her eyes, inhale slowly, smile, and the world, for her, would be right again. But beauty is a strange thing. It comforts, and it poisons. In the court, the queen wore green and black gowns stitched with tiny silver mirrors, so she could see herself wherever she turned. She wore rings on every finger, each with stones to catch and reflect the light. Even her goblet at dinner was polished to a perfect shine. She didn't look at others, only at herself. Snow White, meanwhile, continued to grow. And with every passing year, the court noticed something unsettling. Though she was just a child, Snow White's beauty was beginning to shine brighter than her stepmother's. Her skin held the glow of morning. Her eyes carried the calm of snowfall. Her voice, light, clear, and kind, echoed in people's memory long after she had left the room. And the queen noticed. Not all at once, but in small ways. When the servants paused too long to greet Snow White, when visiting nobles gave her too many compliments, when the mirror took just a little longer to answer, the queen began to ask more often. "Mirror, mirror on the wall." She asked in the mornings. She asked after banquets. She asked in the middle of the night. And every time, the mirror gave her the answer she wanted. For now, one spring evening, after a long festival in the kingdom square, the queen returned to her chamber alone. The torches were low, The candles flickered. Her gown, though perfect, felt tight around her ribs. She walked slowly to the mirror room. She opened the doors. The silence felt different, colder. She stood in front of the glass and whispered, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" There was a pause, a long, pulsing pause. And then the mirror answered, "You were. But now, Snow White is the fairest of them all." For the first time in years, the queen did not smile. She did not nod. She did not speak. She simply stared at her own reflection, unmoving, unblinking, as if she had been struck. Outside, the wind whispered past the windows. Inside, something darker had awakened. She clenched her hands into fists. A ring cracked under pressure. A fingernail broke. The mirror went still. It had said what it needed to say. And the queen said nothing. But her silence was no longer elegant. It was dangerous. The next day, she was all smiles again. She walked beside Snow White through the garden. She praised the cook's honey cakes. She gifted gold earrings to the visiting duchess. But something behind her eyes had changed. Something had cracked. And no one, not even Snow White, could see it yet. But the mirror had. And mirrors never lie. Snow White was now in her 12th year. She no longer toddled through the castle in soft slippers, chasing butterflies or pulling at the hems of gowns. She moved with grace now, quietly, effortlessly, as though the air itself parted for her. Her face still held the gentleness of childhood, but her features were sharpening. Eyes like glassy river pools, cheeks that flushed like morning roses. A smile so genuine it seemed to carry its own warmth. And people noticed. The seamstresses would lower their voices when she entered a room. Maids would pause in their work, just for a moment to watch her walk past. Even the guards, men who had stood silent for decades, would soften their stance when she passed, bowing just slightly deeper than protocol required. Snow White didn't seem to notice. She still knelt to tie her shoes. She still laughed too loudly at the cook's jokes. She still sang to the birds in the courtyard, her voice trailing like wind chimes across the stone walls. She had no crown yet, no jewels, no command. But her presence was starting to feel like royalty. The queen noticed too. At first, it was distant, small, harmless observations in the back of her mind. How Snow White's skin was lighter than fresh milk. How her smile curved perfectly, even when she wasn't trying. How the laces of her gown sat more delicately than they should on someone so young. But those thoughts began to twist, like ivy curling too tightly around a tree. Soon, the queen would catch herself watching the girl longer than necessary, measuring, comparing. Not with affection, but with quiet, burning calculation. One summer evening, during a royal dinner in the East Hall, a visiting countess leaned close to the queen. "Forgive me," she said in a low voice, "but is that your daughter?" The queen's fork paused mid-air. The countess pointed to Snow White, seated 2 chairs away, laughing softly with the court musician. "She's luminous," the countess whispered. "Truly, a rare kind of beauty." The queen turned slowly, her expression unreadable. "She is not my daughter," she said coldly, "though she lives under my care." The countess blinked, startled by the tone. The queen smiled again, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "She is a ward of the court." Later that night in the mirror room, the queen spoke with a whisper sharper than glass. "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" The surface shimmered, the air grew cold, and once again the mirror answered, "Snow White is the fairest of them all." The queen's jaw tightened. She stared, not at the reflection, but past it, into something unseen. In the days that followed, she began to watch Snow White more closely. From windows above the garden, from darkened corridors, from behind half-closed doors. She watched her brush her hair by candlelight. She watched her speak kindly to stable hands. She watched her reading in the orchard, lips moving softly along the lines of some old tale. Each moment was a knife the queen pretended not to feel. She began giving Snow White fewer compliments. No more ribbons, no more combs or necklaces. She stopped asking the girl to accompany her on walks. She stopped answering her questions with warmth. Snow White, ever polite, didn't complain, but she noticed. She spent more time with the birds, more time with books, more time wandering the woods that bordered the castle, where the air felt simpler and the trees did not judge. But beauty, like a candle, only grows more visible in the dark. And Snow White, unaware of the weight her presence carried, only grew brighter. The king, though aging and often busy, still visited her often. He praised her curiosity. He gave her books from distant lands. He called her, "My little star." Each time he did, the queen would retreat to her chamber, jaw clenched, lips still, fingers twitching at her sides. One day, a visiting painter was invited to the castle to capture a new portrait of the queen. It had been years since her last. She stood in her finest gown, still as a statue, her face turned toward the light. But as the artist worked, he found himself glancing toward Snow White, who sat in the corner quietly reading. The queen noticed. She said nothing. But the next morning the painter was gone, sent away, no portrait delivered. And the queen never brought up the matter again. The castle had grown quiet again, not from mourning, but from tension. Servants walked faster, whispered more. Guards exchanged looks when they passed the throne room. And Snow White, though still treated kindly, was beginning to feel something she didn't have a name for. A coldness that trailed her like a shadow. One afternoon, while walking along the inner garden path, she picked a rose and pricked her finger. Blood welled up, just a tiny drop. She stared at it. And for a moment, she thought of a story. One her nursemaid had told her when she was small. A queen, sitting by a window. A drop of blood on black velvet. A wish whispered into the winter air. Snow White smiled softly and wiped her hand with a cloth. But something in her chest felt different. She didn't know it yet. But that story was hers. And stories, when threatened, have a way of protecting themselves. Meanwhile, the queen sat in her chamber, staring into her mirror as if it might change its answer just from fear alone. It didn't. It never did. Snow White is the fairest. Those words did not grow easier with time. They became sharper, colder, louder. Not because of what they meant, but because of what they didn't. The queen had once ruled with beauty like a weapon, but now another's beauty bloomed, naturally, without effort, without need. And the queen was no longer enough. The order came just before sunrise. The queen, draped in a robe as dark as crow's feathers, summoned the royal huntsman to her private chamber. The air inside was cold and unmoving. Incense burned in the corner, and the mirror behind her pulsed faintly in the shadows, silent but watchful. The huntsman bowed low. He was a man of the woods, built strong from years in the mountains, with hands rough from bowstring and blade. He did not speak unless spoken to. He did not question orders, until now. The queen's voice was as soft as falling ash. "Take the girl into the forest. Do not return until she is dead." The huntsman blinked. He thought perhaps he had misheard. Surely this was a mistake, a cruel metaphor, or a punishment for failure. But the queen stepped closer. "Bring me her heart," she said, slipping a small blackened box into his hands, "so I may know your loyalty is pure." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her eyes held him in place, and in them was something colder than any winter he'd known. He nodded once, then turned and left. The morning was quiet when he found Snow White. She stood at the edge of the castle garden, her hands folded politely, her dark hair glinting in the soft sun. She wore a light blue cloak, too thin for the forest chill, but she didn't complain. She smiled when she saw him. "The queen wishes for me to take you gathering," he said, "in the forest." Snow White blinked, surprised, but nodded. "Will we see deer?" she asked softly. "Or foxes?" The huntsman did not answer. He simply turned, and she followed. The forest welcomed them slowly. The stone paths gave way to soft dirt, then moss, then winding roots that curled like sleeping snakes across the ground. Sunlight filtered through the trees in ribbons, falling across ferns and fallen logs. Birds whispered in the canopy, and wildflowers nodded gently with the breeze. Snow White walked a few paces ahead, her eyes wide with wonder. "It's so quiet here," she said, "like the world is holding its breath." The huntsman said nothing. His hand rested on the hilt of his blade. His heart beat slower than usual. They walked deeper, beyond the known trails, into groves where the trees grew taller and the air turned cooler. Snow White knelt to pick a sprig of golden heather. She smiled. "We should bring some back to the kitchen," she said. "The cook always hums when she sees wildflowers." The huntsman's hand tightened. Now. It had to be now. He drew his dagger. Snow White looked up at the sound. She didn't scream, didn't run. She simply looked at him, with a kind of trust that shattered something inside his ribs. "Is something wrong?" she asked. He stared at her, this child born of winter and light, the girl who spoke kindly to birds, who bowed to stable hands, who knew no hatred, only wonder. He tried to raise the blade again. He couldn't. He fell to his knees. "Forgive me," he whispered. "I was sent to kill you." Snow White froze. The forest, too, seemed to still. The wind paused. The leaves stopped rustling. Even the birds quieted, waiting. "The queen," he began, his voice shaking. "She fears your beauty, fears the mirror's words. She gave me this." He held up the box. "She wanted your heart." Snow White took a step back, eyes wide, but not in fear, in sadness. "She hates me that much?" she asked, barely a whisper. The huntsman nodded slowly. "But I cannot do it," he said. "I will not be the hand that ends something so pure." Tears welled in her eyes. She didn't cry for herself. She cried for the woman who once kissed her forehead goodnight, and now wanted her gone. "What should I do?" she asked. The huntsman stood. He looked around, the trees, the sky, the path that wound deeper into the wild. "Run," he said. "Run, and do not return. The queen must believe you are dead. Only then will she stop hunting you." He knelt again, pulling a cloth bundle from his belt. Inside was the heart of a wild boar. "I will give her this," he said. "It will be enough." Snow White stared at the heart. Still, heavy, not her own. She looked at the huntsman and her voice trembled. "Thank you for sparing me." He said nothing, but something softened in his face, just for a moment. Then she turned and ran. The trees seemed to part for her. Branches didn't snag her cloak. Rocks rolled gently from her path. Animals peeked from burrows and dens, watching the girl with the white skin and dark eyes vanish into the deeper woods. She ran until her legs ached, until her breath came in gasps, until the sun began to fall behind the hills and the shadows grew long. She did not stop to cry. She did not stop to rest. She only stopped when the trees grew so thick that even the light seemed unsure of itself. "There," she collapsed. And the forest held her. Back in the castle, the huntsman placed the heart into the queen's box. He carried it back through the halls, past guards who saluted without meeting his eyes, past servants who avoided his shadow. He entered the queen's chamber just as the last light of day touched her windows. She did not rise. She did not speak. She only opened the box. Inside, red, lifeless, silent. She smiled. "You have done well," she said. "Go." The huntsman bowed and left. He never returned to the mirror room, and he never spoke of the girl again. That night, the queen sat before her mirror with wine in her glass and silk wrapped around her arms. She whispered the words, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" And the mirror, deceived by the heart inside the box, answered sweetly, "You are." The queen closed her eyes. She believed the danger was gone. She believed the story was hers again. But deep in the woods, Snow White was still breathing, and fate was still listening. The forest was vast, but it did not feel cruel. Snow White moved between the trees like a ghost of herself, light-footed, breathless, no longer running but not yet resting. Her blue cloak, torn at the edges, brushed against tall ferns and fallen branches as she walked deeper into the unknown. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she could not go back. The last golden light of day had vanished behind the canopy. Above her, the sky was a patchwork of deep blue and soft gray, glimpsed only between leaves that swayed like hands waving her forward. Her shoes were damp with moss, her palms scraped from where she had stumbled once, then twice, and once again. But she didn't complain. She didn't cry. She just listened. And the forest spoke, not in words exactly, but in sounds, in motion. The rustle of leaves when no wind passed, the faint creak of trees settling into twilight, the whisper of an owl's wings high above her head. There was no path, no trail, but the trees seemed to lean slightly, forming narrow corridors of moonlight and shadow, and so she followed the light. She passed beneath arches of ivy and branches heavy with dew. Tiny blue flowers peeked out from between roots like sleepy eyes. A squirrel, no bigger than her hand, paused to watch her pass before darting into the underbrush. Her breathing slowed, her fear loosened. For all its darkness, the forest did not feel like it wanted to harm her. It felt ancient, as though it remembered every step she took, as though it had waited years for her to arrive. When her legs could carry her no further, Snow White found a circle of soft moss beneath an ash tree and collapsed gently onto it. She lay on her back, looking up at the branches above, woven tightly like fingers laced together, holding the stars at bay. She whispered into the quiet. "What happens now?" The wind stirred the leaves in reply as if the forest itself had taken in a breath. The stars slowly emerged. First one, then three, then a skyful. They glimmered through the gaps in the trees like tiny promises. Snow White let her eyes close. She wasn't sure if she would sleep, or if something might find her first. A bear, a wolf, a shadow with sharp teeth. But no such thing came. Instead, she dreamed. She dreamed of her mother, not the queen, but the one she barely remembered. A voice humming over a cradle, a smile that reached the eyes. She dreamed of the queen's garden, of summer peaches and hummingbirds and ribbons tied to apple trees. She dreamed of the huntsman's eyes, wet with regret, hands trembling with mercy. And then she dreamed of the mirror. Not the queen's, but another. A mirror in the middle of the woods, reflecting not her face, but the forest itself. Endless, gentle, alive. When she awoke, the forest had changed. It wasn't brighter, not exactly, but the night no longer felt cold. A gentle fog curled at the base of the trees. The world around her seemed softened, as if the forest had pulled a blanket over itself. She sat up slowly. Birdsong drifted in from far away, tiny notes that sounded more like questions than melodies. Snow White stood. Her body ached, but not painfully. She was hungry, but not desperate. Mostly, she was curious. So she walked. She followed the birdsong, stepped carefully over fallen logs, tiptoed around mushrooms glowing faintly at the base of ancient stumps. A fox trotted past her, red as fire, but did not stop. It glanced her way, then disappeared as if it had melted into the trees. She came upon a small stream. The water shimmered, clear and slow, tiny stones lined to the bottom, pink, white, pale blue. She knelt, cupped her hands, and drank. It tasted like memory, like the kind of water only dreams remember. She continued. The forest thickened again, not with danger, but with mystery. Vines curled like ink on a page. Flowers opened as she passed, petals trembling in the cool air. Somewhere high above, a woodpecker tapped. Somewhere far behind, the past faded. Ahead, something waited. Not something dreadful, something important. She couldn't explain how she knew, only that each step forward felt more like an invitation than an accident. She began to notice shapes in the trees, faces, not real, but formed from knots and bark. Some smiled, some frowned, some looked asleep. One looked almost proud. She smiled back. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. Eventually, she reached a clearing, small, circular, ringed with 7 twisted oak trees that leaned slightly inward, like they were keeping a secret. In the center stood a cottage. It was the smallest house she had ever seen, no taller than a single story, no wider than a carriage. Its windows were round, like eyes half closed. Its roof was moss-covered, the chimney crooked, smoke rising faintly in the moonlight. And the door was just barely open. Snow White stepped forward. She didn't knock. She didn't speak. She simply reached out and pushed the door. It creaked gently. Inside, it was warm. Tiny chairs surrounded a wooden table, each carved with a different symbol: an acorn, a flower, a pickaxe, a leaf. A pot of stew, still steaming, sat on the hearth. Bread on the counter, blankets folded neatly by the fire. But no one was there. It was as if the house had known she was coming. Snow White stood in the doorway for a long time. Then slowly, quietly, she stepped inside. She did not take the food. She did not touch the blankets. She simply sat beside the fire, wrapped her arms around her knees, and listened. The trees whispered through the walls, the wind hummed through the chimney, and something in her heart finally rested. In the stillness, in the flickering warmth of the hearthlight, Snow White whispered, "Thank you." Not to the house, not to the trees, not even to the forest, but to the unseen thread that had guided her, step by step, through the darkness and into this circle of light. She would not know it yet, but she had just found the place where her story would begin again. Snow White sat by the fire, the flickering light painting gentle gold along the walls of the cottage. Outside, the forest still whispered, but the trees had stilled, no longer calling her forward, but holding their breath, as if watching. She was inside now, safe. The tiny cottage felt more like a memory than a place. Everything was smaller than what she knew from the palace, but softer, cozier, more alive. The hearth glowed warmly. The wooden walls were carved with curling leaves. It smelled faintly of pine needles, fresh bread, and something sweet, like honey left out in the sun. She hadn't meant to fall asleep, but curled by the fire, Her head resting on a cushion the size of her lap, she drifted off. When she awoke, the light had changed. Morning light. It poured through the round windows in soft beams, highlighting the gentle dust that floated through the air like tiny stars. Snow White sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes. For a moment she didn't remember where she was. Then she saw the little table, the tiny boots by the door, the 7 mismatched chairs, each carved with its own strange symbol. And she smiled. This was not the palace. This was not the queen's cold chambers. This was something else entirely. This was a home, and it wasn't hers. Not yet. But maybe, for now. She stood brushing off her skirt. Her legs still ached slightly from the day before, but the warmth of the cottage had returned strength to her limbs. She began to explore, quietly, slowly, as if afraid to wake someone. Every step creaked gently on the polished wood floor. The ceilings were low, the doorways small, just the right size for someone half her height. To her left was the kitchen. A wide basin made from smooth stone, a wooden pump for drawing water, and a shelf filled with tin cups no larger than apples. The cupboards were full, jars of dried herbs, stacks of acorn flour, bundles of garlic and dried flowers hanging from the rafters. Someone lived here. 7 someones, perhaps. She tiptoed into the sitting room, where the table was set with 7 plates. Each one held a half-finished piece of bread. Crumbs dotted the table like stars across a dark sky. She didn't touch them. Instead, she looked at the chairs again. One carved with a sun, another with a hammer, one with a flower, delicate and winding. Each chair, though the same size, seemed to carry a different presence, like names without letters. She ran her fingers along the backs of the seats, wood smooth from use, edges worn from hands much smaller than hers. The fireplace behind her crackled softly, as if encouraging her forward. Past the table, she found a hallway, and beyond the hallway, a staircase, narrow, steep, curving gently up and to the right like the inside of a snail shell. She climbed carefully. At the top was a single room, a bedroom, and in it, 7 little beds, each with a different quilt, some patched from dozens of colors, others plain and warm, each with a single pillow, each perfectly made. Snow White gasped softly. She had never seen such small beds in her life. Not even the cribs from her earliest memories felt this gentle. One had a stuffed bird resting near the pillow. Another had a wooden flute tucked beneath the blanket. A third had a pair of woolen socks folded neatly at its foot. Whoever lived here, they were not children, but they were not ordinary men either. She sat on the floor between the beds, and for the first time since fleeing the castle she laughed, quietly, softly. It wasn't joy, not entirely. It was wonder. She had lost everything, her home, her father, her name. But this place, this tiny cottage in the woods, it felt like a story she'd read long ago, and maybe, just maybe, she had wandered into its pages. Hunger rumbled in her stomach. She hadn't eaten since the morning before. Berries and water, nothing more. But she still couldn't bring herself to take what wasn't hers. So instead, she tidied. Downstairs, she swept the floor, careful to avoid disturbing the crumbs. She organized the cups in neat little rows. She folded the blankets by the fire again, smoothing the corners. In the sink, she found a few tin dishes waiting to be cleaned. She washed them gently with warm water and lavender soap, drying each one with a clean cloth from the drawer. She didn't ask herself why. It just felt right. Afterward, she sat once more at the hearth, pulling her knees to her chest. The cottage was brighter now. The sunlight danced on the wood-grain walls. A single butterfly, pale yellow, floated past the window and vanished. She thought of the huntsman, of the forest, of the queen's eyes the last time they'd met. Then she thought of the tiny beds upstairs, the carved chairs, the 7 symbols. She didn't know who lived here, but she hoped, quietly, deeply, that when they returned, they would not send her away. She would explain everything. She would help with chores. She would listen. She would stay out of sight if they preferred it. She just needed somewhere to belong, somewhere she could begin again. The hours passed. The sun climbed higher in the sky. A breeze stirred through the forest, carrying birdsong and the faint scent of pine needles. Snow White sat near the window, a small patch of embroidery in her lap, thread she'd found tucked in a drawer left beside a half-finished cloth. She stitched slowly, clumsily, humming to herself. Something simple, something old. She remembered the tune from the nursery long ago, a song her mother might have sung, a lullaby about flowers that bloomed even in winter. The forest outside remained peaceful, but every now and then she felt the faintest sense of being watched. Not with danger, but with curiosity. A squirrel sat motionless on a nearby branch, blinking. A deer wandered past the clearing, pausing to sniff the air before disappearing behind a birch tree. The world was watching and waiting. As the sky began to turn from gold to amber, Snow White rose. She smoothed her dress. She tidied the kitchen again. She set the table, this time with care, matching each chair to its plate. She lit a few candles one by one, their glow soft and welcoming. Then she sat by the fire, waiting, not with fear, but with hope. She didn't know who would walk through that door, but she was no longer lost. She was home, even if just for a little while. The days that followed were quiet, not the heavy kind of quiet, like grief or fear, but the soft, peaceful quiet of a home finding its rhythm. Each morning, Snow White woke with the sun, just as the birds outside began to sing. Their songs were simple, repeating little melodies that fluttered through the open window like threads of music being sewn into the day. She would lie there for a moment, still, warm, listening, until the first smells of breakfast began to rise from the kitchen below. She had never lived like this before. No servants, no bells, no gowns that needed 3 people to fasten, just a quilt, a smile, a chair by the fire, and 7 little friends who were learning to laugh more each day. Each dwarf had his rhythm, and Snow White grew to know them well. Thorn the leader rose earliest. He polished his tools by the window, muttering quietly to himself as he planned their next mining path. His boots always squeaked slightly as he walked across the floor, and though his eyes remained sharp, they softened when he watched her stir the porridge. Elder was next. He moved slowly, his joints cracking with every step, but he took pride in setting the table, always with the same routine. Spoon, bowl, cup, spoon, bowl, cup. A low hum under his breath, like a tune only he remembered. Moss never truly woke up. He'd wander downstairs wrapped in a blanket, eyes half shut, yawning every third word. Snow White would pour his tea without asking. He always nodded thanks with the same sleepy smile. Brooke tended the garden when he wasn't mining, though tending was a generous word. He mostly sat among the herbs, whittling tiny animals from fallen twigs. He gave her one shaped like a deer, then blushed when she held it close. Stone was loudest in voice and laugh, but surprisingly quiet when he cooked. He liked the challenge of baking bread over fire, and Snow White often helped him knead the dough while they traded jokes with Wick, who never stopped fidgeting with his compass, or fixing a hinge, or measuring a shelf that didn't need adjusting. And Pip, dear bright Pip, was everywhere. Talking, climbing, dancing on stools, he followed Snow White like a shadow made of joy. Their days fell into gentle patterns. After breakfast, the dwarfs would leave with pickaxes slung over their shoulders and sacks of supplies on their backs. Before they went, Snow White helped pack their lunches. Simple things: cheese, apples, thick slices of bread with sweet berry jam. Pip always asked for an extra for the birds, and she'd tie it with a ribbon. Once they were gone, she would clean the cottage, sweep the floors, fold the blankets, and hum as she worked. Her songs were light, sometimes wordless, sometimes half-remembered verses from lullabies the old nursemaids used to sing in the castle halls. The forest outside listened. Deer would approach the windows, pausing in the shade. Birds would perch on the sill, peeking in curiously. One brave chipmunk made it all the way to the kitchen and stole a single blueberry before disappearing behind a broom. She never scolded them. She welcomed them. Midday brought a slower pace. The sun poured in through the round windows, warming the wood grain floors. Snow White would sit beside the hearth, sewing patches onto the dwarf's socks, or peeling apples for the evening stew. Sometimes she'd read, though the books here were few and worn, their pages filled with fables about mountains and stars. And sometimes she'd just sit, not from exhaustion, but from something deeper. Stillness. Something she never had in the palace, something that tasted like freedom. By the time the dwarfs returned each evening, the house smelled of herbs and fresh bread, and laughter filled the air. Wick would tell stories, half-truths about falling rocks and tunnels filled with golden light. Stone would drop his sack of gems with a satisfied grunt. Moss would stretch out by the fire and snore before supper. And Snow White would greet each of them by name. She had never had brothers. She had never had sisters either. But this felt like something close to both. Dinners were always noisy, the table small, the bowls mismatched, the jokes terrible, and yet perfect. Someone would always spill something. Elder would pretend to be annoyed, though he always smiled behind his beard. After supper came songs, not from Snow White, not yet, but from the dwarves. Low, earthy songs, rhythmic, old, sometimes nonsense, sometimes poems passed down like secrets from one miner to another. Snow White listened the first few nights, then hummed along, then, finally, sang. Her voice was soft at first, like a candle being lit, then clearer, then full. And the dwarfs grew quiet. They didn't say anything when she finished. They only smiled wider than they ever had before. At bedtime, she would help them climb the stairs, though they didn't really need it. She would tuck Pip's blanket just so. She would place Elder's walking stick by his bed. She would hand Brooke a new piece of wood to carve in the morning. Then she'd retreat to her own little bed beneath the window. The moon would shine on her pillow. The wind would rustle the leaves outside. And as she drifted off, she would whisper a single word into the dark. Thank you. The queen's voice, the huntsman's blade, the cold fear of running through the woods. It all felt far away now. Not gone, but distant, as though it belonged to another life. And here, in the warmth of the cottage, wrapped in patchwork blankets and soft candlelight, Snow White found something she thought she had lost forever: laughter, and lullabies, and a reason to smile with her eyes again. The sun was beginning to dip when the dwarfs returned. Their boots crunched along the gravel path, voices low and cheerful, sacks of gems swinging over their backs. The scent of pine still clung to their sleeves, and their cheeks were red with cold air and laughter. But when they stepped into the clearing, the cottage didn't feel right. The door was ajar, the chimney smoke had gone still, and the usual glow in the windows was missing. Thorn was the first to sense it. He raised a hand. The others froze. Something was wrong. Inside, the silence was heavy. No scent of soup, No soft singing, no Snow White waiting at the table. The chairs were all in place. The fire was still crackling. But she wasn't there. Then Pip saw her. At the foot of the stairs. Crumbled like fallen petals. Still, pale. They rushed to her. Stone dropped his sack without a word. Brooke knelt beside her, hand trembling. Elder pressed his ear to her chest, listening for anything. Then, a breath. Faint, shallow, but real. "She's alive," Elder whispered. Relief rippled through the room like a sudden wind. Moss sat back against the wall, blinking in disbelief. "What happened to her?" Wick asked. His voice tight. Thorn spotted it first, near her hand. A ribbon, crimson, silken, still gleaming in the firelight. He picked it up carefully. "There was someone here." Brooke frowned. "The Queen?" Stone clenched his fists. "How did she find her?" They gathered around Snow White, careful, gentle. She stirred. Her eyelids fluttered. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. She winced, weakly, then blinked slowly, as if waking from a dream. "Thorn?" she whispered. He nodded. "You're safe now." They helped her sit upright, propped her against the stair rail. She looked dazed. Her hand reached towards her neck. She laced it tight. She said softly, "I couldn't breathe." "Who?" Pip asked, already knowing the answer. "She was a peddler woman. She said I looked pale. She offered me a ribbon. Said it would bring color back." She closed her eyes again. She pulled it tighter and tighter. The dwarfs looked at one another. No one spoke. Then Elder exhaled. "The Queen." Thorn stood. His voice was firmer now. "That means she's still looking, still hunting." Wick nodded. "The mirror must have told her." Snow White opened her eyes again. "I didn't know. She was kind, or she pretended to be." "You're not to blame," Thorn said, "but you must listen now." He knelt beside her, placing a hand over hers. "We love you," he said. "You've made this house more than a home. But it's not just your life anymore. It's ours too. And if something happens to you..." He couldn't finish the sentence. Brooke did instead. "If something happens to you, this place will never feel warm again." Pip tugged her sleeve gently. "You can't open the door anymore." Moss nodded, still half asleep. "Not even for soup." "No matter how kind someone looks," Wick added. "Promise us." Snow White looked at all of them. At their worried eyes, their furrowed brows, their folded arms and trembling fingers. She had never been protected like this. Not truly. She had always been a guest, or a burden, or a secret someone wanted gone. But here, she mattered. "I promise," she said. The dwarves nodded. They believed her. And more importantly, she believed herself. That night, the door was bolted shut, and Thorn placed a small bell above it, just in case. Brooke carved a little wooden charm and placed it on the windowsill. Elder sat by the hearth all evening, sharpening a small blade he hadn't touched in years. Snow White sipped soup by candlelight, her hands shaking less with each spoonful. They did not sing that night. They only sat close, together, watching the fire. And the fire burned, brighter than ever, because they had nearly lost their flame. And now, they would guard it with everything they had. The Queen returned to her tower, seething. The disguise had worked. The girl had trusted her. She had the ribbon. She had pulled it tight. And still, it had failed. Snow White lived. The mirror had told her. Not in words, but in that awful, shimmering certainty that wrapped around her like ice water. She had watched the glass ripple. You are fair, but Snow White, who lives with the seven in the woods, is fairer still. The queen did not scream. She did not cry. Instead, she turned to her shelves and began again. This time, she would be gentler. She would not frighten the girl. She would not rush. She would not even raise her voice. She would arrive as something kinder, a healer, a vendor, a traveling woman with sweet eyes and good intentions. The spell she cast that night worked differently than before. This time, she did not change her face, only softened it. Her skin grew faintly freckled, her hands weathered but not gnarled, her cloak faded but warm. She looked like someone you might trust on a road in spring. And in the small satchel slung over her shoulder, she carried a single, ordinary-looking comb. It was carved from dark wood, inlaid with gold and mother-of-pearl, beautiful but modest, the kind of thing a girl might accept as a gift, or buy for a few coins, or let slip into her hair with a grateful smile. But hidden in the teeth of the comb was poison, not a poison to kill, but one that would silence the mind, still the heart, freeze the blood in delicate silence. The queen left the castle before dawn, shrouded in morning fog, the scent of dew and dust clinging to her new disguise. The woods greeted her with silence. Birds did not sing when she passed. The trees leaned back. Even the roots recoiled. The queen had not been invited here, but she came anyway. Snow White was in the garden when she appeared. It had been 2 days since the last attack. The dwarfs were still cautious, still bolting the doors and leaving behind protective charms when they went to the mines. But the cottage had begun to feel peaceful again. The rhythm of the day had returned. Snow White had woken early that morning. She baked sweet bread. She filled a pail with water. She swept the kitchen floor and sang a little tune about the robin in the rafters. Then she stepped outside. The sun was warm, and the wind was soft. She knelt by the wildflowers just beyond the garden fence, humming gently as she plucked the old petals and whispered kindness to the new buds. That's when the queen arrived. She did not knock. She simply stood beyond the fence, leaning on her walking stick, her head tilted. "Such beautiful hair," she said. Her voice was warm this time. "But it's terribly tangled." Snow White turned, surprised. She stood quickly and brushed her hands on her apron. The woman didn't look like the one from before, not hunched, not cruel, just tired. "Forgive me," Snow White said softly. "Who are you?" "A vendor," the queen replied, lifting her satchel. "I sell combs, brushes, small comforts, things to make life easier." She opened the satchel and pulled out the comb. It gleamed. "I don't mean to intrude," she added, "but I've seen girls tear half their hair trying to untangle it. This one," she lifted the comb gently, "glides through like water over stone." Snow White hesitated. The dwarves had warned her. She wasn't to open the door, wasn't to accept gifts, wasn't to speak with strangers. But this woman had not come to the door. She was outside, not inside, and her eyes didn't seem cruel, just old, lonely. Snow White smiled, though faintly. "It is tangled," she admitted. The queen stepped closer. "May I?" Snow White nodded. "Just once," and turned around. The queen raised the comb slowly, lifting a few strands of Snow White's hair with practiced gentleness. The girl flinched, just a little, as the comb touched her scalp. But it didn't hurt. It was smooth, cool, almost soothing. The comb slid through once, twice, a third time. Then it happened. The fourth stroke dragged slightly. A catch, a tremble. And then Snow White's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes blinked, once, twice, then froze. Her hands dropped to her sides. The wind no longer moved the hem of her dress. The breeze did not stir her hair. She stood perfectly still, like a statue carved from moonlight and sleep. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Her lashes fluttered, and then did not move again. She collapsed gently, as if cradled by the very air. The queen stepped back, smiling faintly. "Sleep, little flower," she whispered. "Sleep, and never rise." She turned, and vanished into the trees. It was Pip who saw her first. The dwarfs had finished early that day. An unexpected cave-in had blocked their path, and Elder insisted they return before sundown. As they neared the clearing, Pip rushed ahead. "Snow White," he called. "We're back early. Guess who found a purple gem?" No answer. "Snow White?" Still nothing. Then he saw her, lying just outside the garden, face pale, eyes closed, the comb still in her hair. He screamed. The others came running. Brooke dropped to her side. Stone pulled the comb free, eyes wide. Wick touched her wrist. "She's cold," he whispered. Moss knelt, tears already gathering. "Not again," Pip whimpered. "Please, not again." But this time, Thorn noticed something different. Her chest rose, then fell, then rose again. Slow, shallow, but steady. "She's not gone," he said. "Just sleeping." Elder leaned close, inspecting the comb. He sniffed it once, narrowed his eyes, then threw it into the fire. "Witchcraft," he muttered. "No doubt." They carried her inside, laid her gently on the couch, covered her with a warm blanket, placed a flower in her hand, and waited. It took until moonrise, but at last, she stirred. A breath, a twitch. Her fingers curled around the flower, and she whispered, "I saw her again." The queen did not scream when she learned Snow White had survived again. She sat before the mirror, motionless, her shadow tall against the stone wall. The mirror rippled and spoke its cruel truth once more. "You are fair, but Snow White, who lives still with the seven, is fairer than thee." Her face did not move. Her eyes did not blink. But deep within her chest, something cracked. Not like glass, like ice. Not fast. Slow. This time, she would not fail. This would not be a ribbon, not a comb. This would be perfect. Simple, deceptive, beautiful. A single apple. The queen went deeper into her tower than she had in years. Beneath the palace, through a door carved into the roots of the mountain itself, lay her hidden sanctum. No torches, no guards.